Southeast Asia is what you just described.
Yeah.
So for longest time, this ASEAN centrality, they don't want to pick sides. I think that is kind of they're coming to the reckoning moment
Mm, mm.
where some of the countries in Southeast Asia faces routine and regular bullying from PRC, whereas others still only see the benefit of that, cash delivering development and infrastructure projects.
Welcome to the Focus Podcast. I'm John Bruni. Today we're joined by Yuki Tatsumi, an expert on Japanese security and Indo-Pacific affairs. Yuki is a senior director at the Institute for Indo-Pacific Security based in Arlington, Virginia. Previously, she served as senior fellow and co-director of the East Asia program and director of the Japan program at the Stimson Center. Before joining Stimson, Yuki worked as a research associate at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, the CSIS, and as the Special Assistant for Political Affairs at the Embassy of Japan in Washington, D.C. The Indo-Pacific has become the decisive theatre of great power competition, where the balance between economic interdependence, military deterrence, and strategic partnerships will define the future of global stability. With Yuki, we'll explore the strength of US-Japan relations, the role of the Quad, India-Japan cooperation, Japan's emergence as a defense exporter, and the disruptive roles of Russia and North Korea. This is a conversation about whether the Indo-Pacific can hold together in an era of shifting power. Yuki, welcome to the Focus.
Thank you, John, for having me.
Yuki, when we talk about strategic stability, what does that actually mean in the Indo-Pacific? I mean, stability for whom and against what kinds of threats?
That's a great question because conventionally speaking, when we talk about strategic stability, we talk about, nuclear weapons, right? USSR back in the day. And I think more and more when we talk about strategic stability in the Indo-Pacific context, it is more about the stability in the relationship between US PRC, great power competition. But for me, I think it's really not this strategic stability in the Indo-Pacific concept is really not against the specific threat, but then it's more about whether the free and open and no coercion regional order or international order writ large can be maintained or not. So, like I said, I really don't think it's targeted at specific country, but then it is targeted at, I think it has a certain behavior in mind that this stands against. And that is about access to global commons, um, and uh, and then, like I said, free of coercion and free and open in terms of access, transit, and so forth, both in a maritime and air.
Yuki, do the smaller states of Southeast Asia define stability differently from the US and Japan? And if you say it's all about, making sure that there's a free and open Indo-Pacific, that also means many things to many different countries and governments. So how do we, in an environment where countries are swinging between the People's Republic of China on the one side and the
Mm.
United States on the other, how does this actually work for the average person in the United States, in Australia? I mean, we look at this very complex mess. We hope our governments know what they're doing. We have our doubts. And then we see all these complex little areas around us doing different things and saying different things because even rhetorically there's no consistency anymore. I mean, there used to be under the old Cold War framework, and even during the unipolar moment of the United States, there was a sort of consistency, a continuity of rhetoric and policy. We're not seeing that now, are we?
I don't think so, no. And then I think another thing that we're not seeing is that whether unipolar or this post-Cold War euphoric era,
Mm,
short-lived euphoric era, in the early 1990s, um, we were, when we talk about stability, we were thinking about, we were actually assuming that there are a certain set of international law and norms that all the countries are expected to follow to some extent. And there's a hefty price to pay if you violate those rules and norms. And I think what we're seeing right now, and this is why I think the phenomena that you talked about is happening everywhere, like Southeast Asia, Pacific Islands, all those, especially the area that has a lot of developing countries, is that those rules and norms that were considered that were very stable and binding and more or less fixed doesn't stay that way.
Yep.
And then I think, you can argue who started this moving the goalpost thing, changing the rule thing first. But then let's be honest, I think both US and PRC are doing it now.
Mm.
So I think that's where the confusion come from. So I think that is why the countries like Japan, Australia, New Zealand, key NATO countries, um, even some of the Southeast Asia countries like the Philippines, Vietnam, Singapore, I think they're all try to see if they can, and then especially India. Now we talked about India. I mean, you talk about Quad,
Mm.
and in South Korea, let's not forget ROK.
Mm. Sure.
Um, all these countries that are developed, industrialized, democratic, more or less, with the possibly exception of Vietnam,
Mm.
um, that these countries are trying to figure out whether if they can kind of band their behavior together and cooperate and coordinate, whether they can salvage these order and norms that still has meaning to everybody who signed up for it. And then those who haven't signed up for it, there is a price to pay. I
Mm.
think that is where this muddling the water comes from. Japan has been trying to figure this out since 2017, I would say.
It's interesting because from an Australian perspective, we have been, I don't know, we've given ourselves the role, I suppose, as the custodian of the South Pacific Island states, the microstates. And,
Yes.
we've had a very difficult relationship moving forward. They think that we're the local bully and so on and so forth. And, there's always been this toing and froing between the South Pacific capitals and Canberra going back years now. But along comes China with bags of money. And what I'm seeing, and I think that this is now something that you can see happen in other places of the world as well, is that with the advent of another pole, the United States being one pole, but now there's this other pole with lots of money to spend, small countries, developing countries, are starting to find that they have negotiating power, that they can go after Chinese money and yet look for protection toward the United States.
Hmm.
I mean, it sounds like a great plan, but ultimately, little countries, historically speaking, always get rolled over by larger countries in time. Now, it may not have happened now because we're still at the opening phases of this confrontation, if you will, between China and the United States. But I would imagine that over time, there is going to be a point at which enough pressure is going to be placed by either Beijing or Washington on various smaller countries around it to lockstep in regards to loyalty to either one side or the other. Do you see this as something that may happen in the future, or do you think that the developing countries will be able to just stay in the middle?
Great question. I think what we're witnessing in Southeast Asia, is precisely what you just described.
Yeah.
So for longest time, this ASEAN centrality, they don't want to pick sides. I think that is kind of they're coming to the reckoning moment
Mm. Mm.
where some of the countries in Southeast Asia faces routine and regular bullying from PRC, whereas others still only see the benefit of that, cash delivering development and infrastructure projects. But then even let's take Indonesia, for example, that, both PRC and Japan bid it for, put in a bid for high-speed rail in Indonesia. And then PRC first won out until Indonesia realized that, oh, but it doesn't really lead to any sustainable job growth in our country. It doesn't really lead to any sustained investment in our country. And we actually might be strapped with incredible amount of debt that we're going to be we're going to be under the huge pressure to pay back in one way or the other. And Indonesia came to the point where, like, okay, we're redoing this all over again. So I think to a different degree, what you just described, which is, not by active pressure on either PRC or United States, but just the reality on the ground that's happening in many of the Southeast Asia countries that have only see the benefit, shall we say, of the investment from cash inflow of the PRC. Some of the countries are recognizing that, oh, there's a big string attached to this, which we don't like. So maybe the alternative was better. Whereas some of the maritime Southeast Asia have been, facing the almost like a daily bullying by Coast Guard and other, fishermen, wave of them. And they kind of came to that point sooner than many of the other countries. So I think what we're seeing right now in Southeast Asia is precisely what you described. It's like, the region, collection of smaller countries realizing, okay, maybe we have to pick a side at one point, but which way are we going? And then I think it's happening in Southeast Asia. I think it's about to start in Pacific Islands. And then I think it will, over time, I think it will start in Africa, Latin America, where there is a, economic power investment competition on the Western democracies on the other hand, on one hand, and the other forces on the other.
This is really interesting, and I suppose it leads to the next logical question, and that is, what do you think of the strength of diplomacy of the countries that are engaging in this sort of, middle power approach, trying to act as a swing state between China
Mhm.
and the United States? I mean, are these countries' ambition higher than their diplomatic capabilities to pull this off successfully?
So I think by the swing state, you mean, countries like, countries in Southeast Asia and South, Pacific Islands, right? So
Correct.
I think I would say that they are trying to put themselves in a position of strength, but the sheer economic size, military capabilities, reality that's unfolding on the ground, I think bring them to a point sooner than later saying, okay, I guess we can't really play the both sides. I think the ultimate, I think all these countries, let's face it, this is nation state system. All the countries are in it for their own national interest. And then I think these countries are in, trying to place their position so because they believe that at this point that will optimize their national interest. But I do think that many of these, what's happening to many of these countries, um, for one reason or the other, they're sooner than later realizing, okay, we're really not optimizing. If anything, by not picking sides or commit to one side, if you will, we are basically being exploited by both or abused by both.
Okay, well, taking the lens further out, let's have a God's eye view of the world at the moment and look at the
Oh,
great
geez,
powers
only,
themselves.
yeah, wish we could have that, right?
Yeah, yeah, well, I'm pretending to be the alien in the room here.
Okay.
So, if we do that and we look at the two big powers and we look at China in particular, now China is kind of ahistoric. We've never really had a major strategic rival be the major workshop of the world ever, right? So this is the first time that we've actually encountered a country like the People's Republic. So if it's not a declared enemy, but it's an implied one, can deterrence happen when your largest rival is also your biggest trading partner? I mean, we're starting to see the difficulties of America trying and not doing a very good job of it, decoupling from China. I mean, the two countries are so enmeshed with one another. And, as much as the rhetoric in Washington keeps on suggesting that, oh no, this is going to be easy. We're going to bring jobs back to America. We're going to decouple from China. We're going to manufacture high-end chips out of the United States. The wish list is long. The capabilities of making this happen in the real world is very small. So what is China? We're always caught in this idea that China is an enemy and therefore it needs to be contained, but it's also the thing that keeps the economy of the world going, right?
That is a that is a $60,000 question, if you will. I think pretty much every single country on earth that identify themselves as a democratic nation is try to grapple with that question. Um, I would point to, not just the United States, but then I would point to Japan first and foremost, because it's just not only one of the major trading partner with PRC, but then also it's there geographically speaking, unless there's more environmental calamity happens and, some kind of continent shifting, moving, going on, they are bound to be in their neighborhood from each other.
Yep.
So I think not too long ago, we are talking about this is a very kind of a this era being a very kind of a ahistoric of two major powers in Asia testing the waters to see if they can peacefully coexist. And those two major powers in Asia that we're referring to was Japan and China.
Yep.
And then I think it quickly devolved into no, not really. Can two major power, like a global power, US and PRC, can peacefully coexist?
Mm, mm.
And I think the conclusion is still not reached by anybody. But like you said, I think that wish list is long, and that wish list can only be achieved if all the other like-minded nations work in kind of a not exact, even if it's not in exactly like a lockstep, but more in the close coordination with one another. And I'm not just talking about United States and Japan. It's multiple.
Mm.
It's basically all the countries that are supposed to be in TPP. It's only to the level where if all those countries that are supposed to be in TPP, including the United States, can coordinate their actions together, that this careful strategic decoupling or de-risking, I guess that's the word that Biden administration used, de-risking is plausible. And as we are seeing right now, things are exactly not going in that direction. So where does that leave us? I think we're still few months in, only a few months in from the change of the administration in Washington. So I would reserve the conclusion of it. But, here we are. Everybody's trying to figure out. And there are ironic factors that most of the countries that are supposed to be in close coordination with Washington to realize to achieve if they all collectively want to achieve this careful strategic de-risking, are basically kind of caught in the middle of bullying the United States that are whipping them with tariff, and PRC, basically they're, that are trying to like steamroll them over with the sheer size of their economic power. So this
Uh,
is not a fun place for anybody. at this point.
I like that. Not a fun place. Okay, so Yuki, just for our audience, you mentioned TPP. I know what it is, but for our audience, can you just give us
Yes.
a brief
Oh, of course.
synopsis of what that is? Yeah.
Yes. So Trans-Pacific Partnership, which is supposed to be the multinational trade and investment initiative amongst all the like-minded free market inclined nations. Not just, I think it started as an Indo-Pacific region targeted toward, launched by Obama administration that anchored that concept of Trans-Pacific Partnership as one of the two pillars for peace and prosperity in the Pacific,
Yeah.
right? So the economic front, that was Trans-Pacific Partnership. And then the other front was this alliance systems that have a very complex structure.
Yuki, when we were discussing things earlier, you made mention about Japan and China having to cohabit in a tightly bound region, which is interesting because, of course, the People's Republic of today would not have existed without significant Japanese investment from the time that Deng Xiaoping opened China back in 1978. So I'm thinking to myself, how does this interdependence either afford Japan power over Beijing, or is that not a thing? I mean, the Japanese companies have gone in, they've done their investments, they're not connected to Tokyo in any way, shape, or form, and so there's no real economic leverage that Japan can exercise over China if China becomes a bit too bullish, shall we say.
So that's a good question, but Japanese investment in China predates Deng Xiaoping because it actually goes a little bit further back when Japan and PRC first normalized its relationship because it was understood back then that it was part of the what was considered as a wartime repatriation, but
Yeah.
it was in lieu of that there's ODA, there's other forms of investment, and with the private sector, Chinese market with the more affordable labor cost and huge potential market was definitely attractive place to invest. But I do think that starting around 2011, um, Japanese private sector begins to risk hedging, moving some of the production hubs out of PRC, looking for alternative places, and that attention had shifted toward Southeast Asia, for example. I think that is when Japan is kind of waking up to the fact that um, China does not hesitate to mix security, political, military talks, diplomatic tension, or diplomatic relations, and economic relations. That it's more like a, all of a, whole of the government approach to external relations. And then I think Japan came to realize that around 2011, 2010, 2011, when there was I think it was more like 2010, that there was a instance where there was a dispute around the Senkaku Island. Japan arrested the captain of the fishermen boats owned by, operated by PRC fishermen. But then PRC government in return halted some of their rare earth export to Japan, also detained a couple of the some Japanese businessmen working in China for suspicious activities, which tends to be unfounded. So that was, I think, like a moment of the awakening for Japan.
Mm.
And then I think Japanese businesses begin to really kind of start to de-risk. And then I think Washington kind of came to that realization a little bit later.
Would you say that Japan's de-risking and decoupling from China is more successful and more coherent as a strategy as opposed to what's happening in the United States today?
I think it's definitely more careful and more strategic and more incremental in the way that, there's like a less one, big shock to the system,
Yeah.
that it's more of a gradual process for this Japanese corporation to wean itself off of certain things that China offered. So it seems to me that it does seem more coherent, but let's not forget that the Japan's economic size is far smaller compared to that of the US economy. So, it's far less dramatic. But yes, I think Japan's process of start de-risking is much more gradual, much more careful. And therefore, I think I would say it it is it is very successful, although there are still many issues when it comes to intellectual properties and all that. But
Now, the other elephant in the room, if you will, how would you characterize the current state of US-Japan relations in the face of shifting US domestic politics? How much does the Trump presidency shape Tokyo's thinking about security guarantees? How do you like them apples?
oh, geez, yes, yeah. Current, actually, Trump administration, current, Trump 2.0, as we usually refer to it,
Mhm.
um, it does hugely shape Japan's thinking. But the process actually started from Trump 1. And some of the strategic thinkers in Tokyo actually noticed that current US tendencies to look inward from the Obama administration. But I think it was more accentuated and more kind of in your face kind of turn during the Trump 1.0. And then also Messenger was very different. It was much less, the message was much less sugar coated, shall we say.
Yeah.
And that definitely, so when Trump 1.0, I remember talking to my colleagues in Tokyo who said, we're still trying to figure out whether this is anomaly or this is kind of an enduring trend going on in the United States. And I think even under Biden administration, I think those same group of people, same group of colleagues that I've talked, I'm speaking to, did notice that although their messaging turns much softer, much more collegial, much more inclusive, but their behavior really didn't change all that much.
Right.
After all, it's under Biden administration that was, that passed the CHIPS Act, and US government made a sharp move toward protecting a lot of sensitive information, sensitive technologies, and kind of started build a firewall.
Mhm.
So Trump 2.0, in a sense, really didn't come as a huge shock in two ways. One is that they kind of already noticed that trend, even during Biden administration, that some of that tendencies are kind of transcended from Trump 1.0. And secondly, they kind of have seen Trump 1.0, so they kind of knew what to expect. So in those two ways, they were less shocked. But nonetheless, like you mentioned, I think it is shaping the way that Japan looks at its own security guarantees. And then I think the answer to Japan, for Japan, the answer to safeguarding its own security now is really what was dubbed back in the day, early 2000, as a middle power diplomacy. So Japan really is doubling down in recent years with investing, from a top of the leadership all the way down to the bureaucracies. It has been investing so much energy into shoring up its relationship with other US allies. Australia comes to the first, comes to the top of the list in the
Mhm.
Indo-Pacific. But then, um, ROK is a little bit tricky, different case studies because
Of course.
it always is.
Mm,
But when you look at, and then they start looking across the globe, and then they start doing this major outreach with UK, for example, or
mm.
Germany or France. So that kind of is their answer of, okay, we need to start hedging, but then hedging on the other side, meaning PRC, is definitely not an answer for them. So what are they hedging? Who are they hedging toward? It is other US allies who shares the same concerns about durability of the US leadership, durability of the, deterrence power of the United States, and so forth.
Okay, Yuki, I would argue that Japan was very much advantaged during Trump 1.0 in having the late Prime Minister Shinzo Abe in charge because he almost intuitively understood that the only way to overcome Donald Trump's peculiarities is by striking up a personal relationship with him and by doing what we're now starting to see many other countries do, and that is give him the idea that he's the emperor of the world, give him the idea that he's in charge of everything, and quietly work a subtext or a backstory to ensure that their national security hasn't or isn't going to be compromised by, some American surprise. So do you think that in that sense, Japan has got a continuity of thinking between because and I'm glad that you mentioned that there was a continuity of policy that Japan or Tokyo that had with Trump 1.0 and into Biden and now back into Trump because I think many people who tend to look at the news cycle and in this highly divisive environment that we live in, somehow Biden and the Democrats were better than Trump. And in actual fact, when you strip away that rhetoric, you see that the country itself, the United States itself, is very consistent in the way that it shows itself to the world. So Trump might have started something, but it continued under Biden, as you say, with softer language perhaps, but very abrasive policy underneath it. And then, of course, Trump comes back into the White House, and it's all on for young and old once again.
Absolutely. You see what they learned, that European leaders especially learned from Abe's playbook, Mr. Abe's playbook, and President Trump's just concluded state visit to UK.
Yeah.
All these pomps and gold caps of the honor guard, and they figured that all out.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, and then I think Japan still very much rides on that wave
Mm.
of President Trump. Still think of his time as a president and his engagement with Japan much more on a positive light. Doesn't mean that he's going to go any softer on trade talks, but at least he's coming, Japan definitely is at advantage of having him coming in from, oh, I had a great relationship with Japan when I was president last time around.
Mm. Mm.
And then I think you saw ROK kind of try to recover from the damage from the Trump 1.0 when their new president, Lee Jae-min, was in town at the end of August, right? I mean,
Mm.
he continued to talk about what a great new decoration, gold decoration that he did in the Oval Office. He talked about President Trump as like a peacemaker of the Korean Peninsula, all that. So they clearly learned from the playbook that Mr. Abe firmly established.
Yes.
So yeah,
Yes, they did.
so they absolutely did. Even EU, EU chair
Yeah.
on the joint announcement of their trade deal, she got the lingo down, right? This is a
Mm.
great trade deal. It's going to create so many jobs in the United States. We're going to invest so much in the United States. I mean, they all have that lingo down.
Yeah.
And they all have to thank late Mr. Abe, who wrote that
Mm.
playbook for them to get them better prepared, because clearly they are so much better prepared than 1.0.
Look, Yuki, I understand the necessity for why we're all going down this
Yeah.
path, but as someone who takes, oh, I don't know, I look at this crawling as diplomacy behavior towards Trump as something that's an offense to everyone's sense of nationhood, shall we say, and sovereignty,
Yeah.
because we're all bowing and scraping towards someone who's not who's completely undeserving. He is just a human being, right? His gold-gilded palace in the White House and Mar-a-Lago notwithstanding. But I understand, the reality is that we are in this situation and we've got to deal with the devil as we see him, not as we would like to see him. So I get it, but it still makes my skin crawl when I think about it because it's like, well, gee, since when have we ever been like this? Unless, of course, we all assume that we're, in a submissive position toward the United States, which again is another question that possibly can be asked in another podcast.
So I think I would say, that this is where I would go back to is that all the countries, including Japan, Australia, UK, all those countries are acting in to protect their national interest, right?
Yeah.
And if pumping and basically golding him up is the way to protect the national interest, I think the leaders would, whether we personally think it's tasteful or not, should absolutely go down that route if that is
Mm,
the way to protect the national interest.
mm.
Um, and then I do think that different leaders have a different degree of success, honestly.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I would say that is more of a necessity at this point. But what I would wonder though often is that what happens after this Trump 2.0?
I'm glad you raised that point because again, I'm thinking if the American public, and we have to look at policy and government and the general popular public as two different sides of the
Yes,
same coin. So if, for instance, diplomacy then becomes a little bit more edgier after Trump, where no one pretends to give two hoots what the Americans think anymore about anything. And so then the language then becomes abrasive from countries like Japan, like Australia, like the UK. Whereas, prior to that, we were all crawling to Trump. This is going to be a shock for many Americans. And I think that from an American policymaking perspective, those people who doubt the Trump 2.0 has any magic to it, they're going to be sitting back, scratching their heads, wondering how do we get back to a better form of diplomacy with all these countries that we forced to behave toward our president a certain way, and now they're just saying enough. That's going to be a shock to a lot
right.
of people, I think. Mm,
I think so. And then also, I think that's what I think a Biden administration, I would argue, like following
yeah,
Trump 1.0,
yeah,
spent like their first year doing that,
mm,
changing the tone, changing the message. I think they literally spent like the first year in into that administration, basically,
yeah,
digging themselves out of that
mm,
more abrasive rhetoric of the previous administration. And I would imagine Republican or Democrat, the follow-on administration will have to do more or less the same thing.
mm.
Uh, well, what we actually meant when the previous administration said X, we meant Y. You know, and if it's not Y, it would just really not the proper way of saying it,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
And then I think for a lot of issues, I would say though that that's what Biden administration ended up doing
The
because when
Egyptians
it
have a
comes,
Oh, sorry, Yuki. The Egyptians have a beautiful way of putting this, and that is talking out of both sides of one's mouth. And
mm,
I suppose that's the key to diplomacy in many ways, but also it's the key to inconsistency and making mistakes
yes,
at the diplomatic level, because governments won't be able to trust the word of the other country if this continues on. There has got to be a sense of truth telling in order to get to a mutually beneficial place, I think, anyway.
So I think that is why it could be that actual voters could be much smarter than what experts give them credit for. Take
Yeah.
Japan, for example. Their voters clearly understands how to differentiate the rhetoric that's coming out of the White House at this moment
Mhm.
versus what the US Japan relationship means to them and what the United States as a country means to them. So if you look at their public opinion poll, you would find that likability of President Trump may be mixed at best, but when the same pool is asked about what do you think about US Japan relationship? Do you think America is an important country? Do you like America? A lot of, vast majority of them answered positively. So it could be that, voters are actually, of outside the United States are much smarter in terms of differentiating the rhetoric that comes with the government at the moment versus looking at more of an enduring nature of the relationship with the United States.
But even this is very complex, and let's just take a moment to unpack some of this. Yes, I think you're right, and I think that the polling can come up with certain things that show, and very clearly that the idea in the public imagination of the US-Japan treaty holding sway is very strong. What they think of the US president is a completely different kettle of fish. But tell us something a little bit more about the US security guarantee. I mean, are there voices in Japan considering greater self-reliance, even in the nuclear sphere? Because
Mm,
there are quiet doubts about America's long-term reliability. Going back to what we were saying just earlier, if Trump 1 set the tone and Trump 2 is doubling down, whoever comes whoever becomes the president after this one and then the one after, there's going to be a sort of policy continuity moving forward, which then raises the question, how real are we seeing America positioning itself under the Trump rhetoric, and
mm.
how coherent will that be moving into, say, a J.D. Vance administration, or even another Democratic administration that we can't even fathom yet? But you say that there is a change in politics. What changes to strategic guarantees might become more obvious over time, because we're just not seeing that in the short political cycles that we're dealing with.
So I think that when it comes to nuclear and Japan's attitude to nuclear, they're still primarily looking at North Korea and the regional responses.
Yeah, yeah.
And there are a lot of triggers and some catastrophic collapse to the confidence in the alliance with the United States is one, but more immediate one, at least amongst the Japanese policymakers, strategic thinkers of today, is what ROK might do in terms of their own indigenous nuclear capability, because they pay really close attention to what kind of a domestic debate that is going on in ROK about what their own nuclear future. And that is because Japan already find itself pretty much surrounded most by nuclear powers, like most of its neighbors, Russia, China, de facto North Korea. If ROK joins that group, that is a huge game changer for Japan.
Yeah.
And at that point, whether US extended deterrence guarantee or US security guarantee, and how effective that is, it probably has a less impact on Japan's strategic thinking, because clearly that guarantee that Japan thinks is there was not enough to deter ROK from going nuclear.
Mm.
So they're primarily, number one, they're primarily focused on North Korea, but then number two, they pay far closer attention to what the domestic debate that's going on in the ROK on this one, in terms of when you think about Japan's own nuclear future. And yes, there is a voice within Japan, as there has been for many decades, about buffing up its own indigenous military capability, including nuclear. The voice advocating for nuclear capability has still been, so far, it's pretty marginal. Main consideration is that you know, U.S.-Japan alliance is still there, looks pretty resilient over the change of time. They seem to have so far survived even Trump number one, Biden, and so far it seems to be surviving under Trump number two. U.S. forces in Japan is going to get an upgrade in
Yep.
terms of its authority, personnel, staffing, so forth. So that gives a certain level of confidence boost and operational way, and like a real sense of boost in terms of its credibility. Um, so that is why I think for now, Japan's debate about nuclear future focuses more on what's happening and what will happen eventually in the debate within ROK. There are definitely long-term concerns about U.S. PRC, nuclear force strategic stability issue, especially now that Russia set a bad precedent in terms of nuclear weapon, like saber rattling, and in relations to its aggression in Ukraine. But North Korea one is a far more urgent. So they are very worried about North Korea getting more in line with Russia and kind of getting onto this bandwagon of, I think now we call it crinks, I guess, China, Russia,
Yeah.
Iran, and North Korea
Yeah.
club.
Crinks. Love it.
Crinks. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, so all right, so we talk about the crinks on the one side, but also in the Indo-Pacific we have this thing called the Quad, which is being called everything from a talk shop to the backbone of Indo-Pacific stability. Where do you see its actual role today, Yuki?
So Quad, I think this is an interesting moment for Quad, because I think Quad has demonstrated its value in a lot of things that are not hard security. Disaster relief, public health, environment, trade promotion, all that. But I think when it comes to hard security issue, um, India turned out to be an outlier, especially when Russia invaded Ukraine. And now that US India relations has gone quite sour because of the tariff, which actually triggered by India's continued import of Russian energy and to some extent Russian weapons, um, their Quad is kind of in a interesting place, to say, put it modestly. And then I think that is why certainly there are far greater focus within Japan about US, Japan, Australia triangle when it comes to more of a political, military, strategic issue,
Yeah.
because that's where Tokyo sees greater alignment. But I also have to say that amongst all the four in Quad, Japan actually may be the one country that has a very positive relationship and has also invested a lot in all these other three partners on a bilateral setting. So Japan's kind of investment or efforts in India is pretty much bipartisan. And then also Japan-Australia relations, we've seen it blossoming in the
Yes.
last few years. And then, Japan continues to invest in doubling down on the in its alliance relationship with the United States. So from Japan's vantage point, it invests in all three.
Mm.
But as a Quad, it is kind of in an interesting place. I think Japan still continues to see a value in non-military issues, non-security issues in terms of policy coordination, whatnot. But I think Japan's a lot of strategic thinkers, policymakers begin to clearly see the limit that the Quad could go when it comes to more of a hard security.
Yuki, I was always a bit of a Quad skeptic myself because, I mean, you've got three American allies, inclusive of the United States, as one bloc, and then you've got a strategically autonomous player in India on the other side of the equation. Now, India and Russia, whether under the old Soviet system or under the Russian Federation, India's always been close to that country, and it's always sat kind of on the outside. The one thing that you mentioned earlier about the oil thing, I mean, our last podcast, which will be released today, was with the former Director General of Indian Artillery, and he had some very interesting things to say about the Quad, not very good
Hmm.
ones. And I would argue that that's a reflection on a growing lack of trust among Indians who look at the United States and say, you're failing to see our part of the world and how we see things. You're only seeing it from your perspective. Your tariffs, your secondary tariffs on our importation of Russian oil is going to hurt our economy in a way that you can't even fathom. Because basically, the Russians are giving away a lot of oil to India, which helps the Indian industrial juggernaut move ahead. Now, anything that cripples that flow of oil is going to
Mm.
have a deleterious effect on India. From a diplomatic perspective, a government to government perspective, I can see that New Delhi would have major problems with the United States and its allies who are backing the United States position on this. So again, was the Quad a stillborn organization? I mean, it was always
Mm.
going to have its problems, but now those problems have been completely revealed through the Trump secondary sanctions. And I think that there is a setting within New Delhi that now says, to hell with the Quad and to hell with the United States. And therefore, we saw Modi holding hands with Putin and Xi in Beijing only recently. I think that that was a huge signal, and I don't think it was a very stabilizing signal that the Indians had shot across the bows of the West in the Indo-Pacific. And if India becomes what we in the West would consider a rogue player, the stability of the region is going to be at stake, right?
So I think that's absolutely that optics that Modi played out in Shanghai Cooperation Organization Summit was not a good one.
Yeah.
It was not a stabilizing one. However, less, attracted far less attention, but still nonetheless very significant, was what Modi did previous week in Tokyo. Modi visited Tokyo, went on to the joint conference, and reaffirmed free and open and coercion-free Indo-Pacific principle. Mm-hmm. And to me, that is that rhetorically, Modi is clearly upset with Washington of what they did, and that they're not happy with the secondary faction. Who would?
Mm.
But they're not. They haven't completely abandoned the free and open and Pacific idea either. But you know, for now, for all intentions and purposes, with the secondary sanction, U.S. tensions in U.S.-India relations bilaterally is too high to address any of this.
Mm.
But Japan can lend India a quite willing ear in terms of what it thinks it's important. And that is why I mentioned that it is very important that Japan continues to enjoy a very positive relationship with all three partners in Quad.
Mhm.
And what is ironic is what brought the Quad partner closer together was really the convergence of all the four countries' perception, not on Russia, but on PRC.
Yeah.
India didn't like the fact that China, PRC start making trouble in the Indian Ocean and they continue to have, persisting border issues and the land border. And basically this whole thing of Russian invasion of Ukraine kind of threw everything out of the whack, that what four countries thought was a strategic conversion was really not a strategic, convergence at the fundamental level, that it was more reactive convergence in their collective responses. And when it comes to something like the development outside of the Indo-Pacific region, it is a completely different ballgame. And I think this, Russian insertion kind of proved us that. So maybe Quad, maybe it's not necessarily a stillborn, but it does have a limit, and that its vulnerability to these out of the impact of this out of area development is now kind of a plainly demonstrated for everyone to see, because we all kind of thought about India being wishy-washy vis-a-vis PRC. That's what we were focused on, because we're only talking about free and open Indo-Pacific, which Russia was not exactly a part of this Indo-Pacific, free and open Indo-Pacific equation. And now it's actually exactly that, and not even what Russia has done in the Far East, but then what Russia did squarely in NATO front, like Eastern front of NATO, is kind of messing this up all.
Yeah, sure is. Anyway, if you're enjoying this conversation with Yuki Tatsumi, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. What do you think? Is the Indo-Pacific stable because of deterrence or unstable because of economic dependence on China? Drop your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear from you. Now back to the show. Yuki, India and Japan, as you had described earlier, are often described as natural partners in balancing China. Where do you see the most tangible cooperation today?
I think more in the economics. There's a, you know, Indian population in Japan is growing due to Japan's continued investment in the IT industry. And also, I think there is that durability and the strength of that relationship, that this fondness that has been shared across the political spectrum in Japan toward India um, is um, is is really, I don't see that change. Culturally, obviously, it's very different. Um, but I think, yeah, I mean, I think it's more like a people to people and economic front, and to the extent possible. So mostly on the humanitarian assistance, disaster relief front, military to military. But it's more in the disaster relief, kind of a resiliency supporting realm,
Yeah,
because
yeah.
the inception of the Quad really is from this collective nucleus response to Indonesian tsunami back in 2000, early 2000s, right? Everybody has to, when we think about security cooperation amongst the Quad partners, we all have to kind of remind ourselves that that's where it actually started. It was never about this tangible, more of a conventional threat. It was more about this, large disaster relief response that brought these four countries together.
Japan has ongoing problems with the Russian Federation over the Kuril Islands to the north of Japan. Um, do the respective relationships between India and Japan with Russia complicate coordination or deeper coordination between the two countries, Japan and India?
I think the Japan-Russia relations, Prime Minister basically, Kishida squarely put it on hold on the Kuril Island, negotiation front. That
Yeah.
basically, Japan simply cannot negotiate with Russia while Russia is waging war against Ukraine. That does not necessarily mean, I don't think that necessarily puts a limit in terms of Japan's relationship with India, because Japan-Russia, I guess, tension over this Kuril Island issue is so compartmentalized to a
Right.
strictly bilateral issue, that that is really an issue between Tokyo and Moscow. Not really doesn't it really doesn't impact Japan's relationship with other partners, except back in the day when Russia invaded Ukraine, Crimea, 2014, 2015, and Obama administration wanted to do sanctions, and Japan didn't quite go along with it because Prime Minister Abe at that time saw potential diplomatic opening. But then
Mm.
it has nothing to do with India. It's more about U.S.-Russia tensions and kind of Japan caught in the middle and try to, figure out its maneuvering range. So
Now, it's interesting that you make this case that there is a compartmentalization of diplomacy. When we're trying on the one side to see the Indo-Pacific as a whole construct, and then in within that construct, rather than see interlinkages between one crisis and the other, and within the power games of the great powers within that region, we're seeing subsets, we're seeing various issues, bilateral issues being, pushed to one side and not seen from the Indo-Pacific whole. Which then leads me to the other question. Does today's leadership in Tokyo still embrace former Prime Minister Abe's Indo-Pacific vision?
absolutely, absolutely. Even
Right.
even Prime Minister Ishiba had to admit that. So
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Okay. So, getting back into the Indo-Pacific issue, and Japan's role, Japan's decision now to sell 11 Mogami-class frigates to Australia marks a historic shift in its post-war defense posture. What do you think is driving this change?
um, so Japan has been trying to trying to compete internationally when it comes to defense industry. It
Yeah.
obviously have to be selective in terms of where it can compete. And then I think that strength of Japan-Australia bilateral security relations, and then also Japan's most recent experiment with their own next generation fighter. It's a trilateral cooperation between UK and Italy.
Mm.
I think gave them enough confidence to try this again, a few years after their failure in their first trial in their submarines.
Correct. Yes, I was involved in that in a very indirect way. We at Sage International hooked up with the Royal United Services Institute of Australia to set up a conference prior to the competitive evaluation process on the Collins class replacement. And of course, our little team were backing the Japanese over and above the other contenders. And it was a real shame that we didn't do it, because what we did manage was that we managed to get the then Prime Minister Tony Abbott to step back from saying Japan has the right to build all submarines out of Tokyo and then shipping them across to Australia, because we in South Australia wanted to keep the submarine yard here viable. And the only way that we could do that is by license producing Japanese technology in Australia. So we did get a win there. But of course, it's all history now, right?
Right.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, so let's now look at the disruptors of the Indo-Pacific, Russia and North Korea. Russia's growing alignment with China is reshaping Northeast Asian politics. Do you see Moscow as a genuine Indo-Pacific player or more of a spoiler?
I would consider Russia as more of a spoiler. Their focus always has been on a continental Europe. They always looked at their Eastern Front, um, their Far Eastern Front. They look at it to the extent that they can spoil things for that particular side of their continent.
If Russia is a spoiler, and we see Russia and China having naval exercises in the waters of Northeast Asia. Is that still something to be concerned about? Or is it kind of like, well, China's doing most of the heavy lifting, the Russians have got their ships, but really, I mean, what sort of power do they project into the region because they're already involved in a shooting war in Europe?
No, because so Japan still has to consider Russian um, capability in its calculation, because total number of ships that Japan possesses is limited compared to
Hmm.
Russia and China combined together.
Right.
And Japan also saw that in display while its own force tries to respond to its triple disaster back in 2011, where China and Russia basically did airspace incursion, basically testing Japan's capacity to respond to that. And they managed to do so, but then they were very stretched. They're very much stretched. So they have their hands full with PRC. It'll be a bad news if Russia, even on the side of their eye kind of thing, while their primary focus continues to be on the European front, but they still try to distribute allow some of their engagement forces in Far East to do their own thing.
Okay, Yuki, final two questions. North Korea continues to advance its missile and nuclear programs while deepening ties with both Russia and China. How does this complicate Japan's security calculus?
Very much. Um, Japan spent the last decade and a half swinging its force posture from looking squarely at northern front, Russia, towards southwestern island, which is PRC, Taiwan Strait. North Korea nuclear threat comes right in the middle. So it does complicate its calculation in terms of force posture and then also investment in their capability, frankly. Whether they continue, how do they balance between their continuous investment between ballistic missile defense and the preemptive strike capability that are targeting primarily North Korea, while continue to build up their capacity to respond and deter PRC and PRC's bad behavior on the southwestern island front.
Yuki, final question. Suppose you look 5 to 10 years into the future. What do you see as the biggest test of Indo-Pacific strategic stability? Taiwan, the South China Sea, the East China Sea, the Korean Peninsula, or something less obvious?
I would say all those fronts happening at the same time,
Oh, wow. Well, there's a nightmare scenario. Yeah.
because I can definitely see those, different areas, South China Sea, East China Sea, closer to Taiwan Strait, begins from what Japanese call it, dubbed as a gray zone, which is,
Yep.
right below the threshold of military, and basically spiral out of control because all sides for miscalculation or miscommunication basically fail to manage the tension. I can easily see that happen, across the board.
Right, right. Okay, well, on that rather depressing note,
I
Yuki, thanks
know.
for sharing your insights on the focus.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
What this conversation with Yuki Tatsumi, Senior Director of the Institute for Indo-Pacific Security, makes clear is that strategic stability in the Indo-Pacific is far more than a military equation. It's about trade and deterrence, politics and partnerships, credibility and uncertainty. The Indo-Pacific is not frozen in balance, it's dynamic, with China's rise, America's shifting role, and new players like India and Japan taking on responsibilities they once avoided. Add in the unpredictable behavior of Russia and North Korea, and we see a region in constant negotiation with itself. Perhaps the objective measure of stability isn't whether conflict is avoided, but whether the Indo-Pacific's key actors can adapt fast enough to prevent one crisis from cascading into something much larger. Now, on to questions for the audience. Should the Quad become a formal alliance or remain an informal partnership? Is Japan emerging as a genuine military power again, or will its economy still hold it back? Who do you see as the bigger disruptor to Indo Pacific stability, Russia or North Korea? Let us know in the comments section below. If you enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. It's a free way to support us. You can also subscribe to the podcast on the Ozcast Network, iTunes, and Spotify, where we'd appreciate your 5-star reviews. Do you have comments or questions about the podcast? Post them in the comments section on YouTube, and I'll do my best to respond to as many as I can. My thanks as ever to the producer of The Focus, Neil Smart. Please stay connected with us on social media. Follow me on X at BruniDoctor, and follow The Focus on X at TheFocus_Sage. And don't forget Blue Sky on the Focus podadl.bsky.social. From Adelaide, South Australia, you've been listening to The Focus.